once we have our environment set, we can change some of the camera settings to better manipulate our scene and fine-tune it. So to do that, we'll click on the preview camera. And some of the things that we can change here is we can change our field of view. So that if we wanted to even increase in or get a far back field of view, we can change that and scale that. We can also change our aperture to get that beautiful depth of field. So we can crank it up really large to get a very shallow depth of field. We can also change the position, target, and the up angle of our camera. And one of the new features that's been added is the 3D stereo. So if we click this, it will allow us to use which is the same button that's up here, is the anaglyphic stereo glasses, either the red and blue or the pink and green glasses, to be able to view our scenes in stereo. We can also adjust our stereo distance here to help further separate that out. So that's kind of a neat thing to do. So with this scene, I just wanted to crank up the aperture a bit, and we could actually zoom in and take a look at some depth of field in our scene. And again, one of the things that's neat is we have an autofocus where whatever's in the middle of the scene is perfectly in focus. We can turn that off though, and we could turn our autofocus picker so that if we wanted to focus in on a specific element in our scene, we could click on that and the depth of field will focus directly to that element. One of the other things that we'll want to do is adjust our imager settings. So to do that, we'll click on our Preview Imager button, and that'll allow us to change things on the scene like our exposure. So independent of our power of our lights, we can play around with and adjust our exposure, and that's all done on the GPU as well. We can adjust our f-stop and our ISO, and also adjust our gamma settings. We also can adjust how much vignetting we get. So you can go real extreme or adjust that to anywhere you'd like to set your artistic preference for your image. There are also a bunch of camera response curves, so that if we wanted to actually use real camera response curves, we could choose on any of these presets and actually get the response curve for that actual camera. So you can get some really nice effects and colorations of your render using these settings. Okay, there's just a few more things I'd like to show you before we finalize up. So we have our scene continuing to render here. Now if we'd like to take a look at this in a couple different ways, we have a couple of buttons here that are new. One is that we have our ambient occlusion, so that we can click that button and we can take a look at our scene and just look at the geometry that's there, and we call that clay rendering mode. And then we also have a colored clay mode where it renders everything just with the diffuse color that it's set on currently. So those are some pretty interesting modes that allow you to visualize your scene a little bit more. We also have two different rendering kernels. So if we want to adjust those, we click on the Preview Kernel button. Right now it's set at direct lighting, which is more of a traditional ray tracing mode where it's got just, I believe, a single bounce and ambient occlusion to give you a decent render. But one of the things that we'd like to do is change that to path tracing, which will give us our true unbiased rendering quality. Another thing that we'll want to adjust is some of the parameters here. We can adjust our maximum depth, and 8 is a pretty good depth, and we can pretty much run it up as high as we want, but in all reality, greater than 16 doesn't show much effect because most rays have already died by that time. We can also increase the max samples, which tells us when the rendering is going to stop. It's set at a default of 12,000, but in all reality, we don't need that many. You could stop the render whenever you're happy, and already we're just at 120 and it's starting to clean up nicely, so you could stop the render whenever you'd like. But typically between 2,000 and 5,000 samples you can get a very clean render. One of the other last settings that we'd like to change is the filter setting here, and right now it's disabled. Now what filtering is that sometimes on the diagonals or on the edges inside the render you'll see some aliasing or stair stepping. So by clicking that, it will cause our render to take just a little bit longer in time, but it'll also clean those up by helping us to anti-alias those edges as well. So when we're happy with all of our settings, we could go back over to the screen resolution and we could crank that up to a much higher setting, and then we'll just let the render cook. And when it's completed, we could use the little button right here and save our render to an image file, and then have our nice finished render.